Good day, everyone. So we will be our presenters in the topic poetry. So in this video, we will be discussing the different methods and techniques of teaching poetry to our students. The subject-centered method will be discussed by yours truly, Miss Sharon Aurelia, while the teacher-centered method will be discussed by Miss Karen Joy Sunga, and the learner-centered method will be discussed by Miss Carmela Hirona and Miss Cristel Malaya. So before we start with the presentation, let's have the objectives first. So our objectives for today is to discuss the different methods and techniques in teaching poetry and apply these methods and techniques in our poetry lessons. So when we say poetry, it is a type of literature that is based on interplay of words and rhythm. In poetry, words are strung out together to create sounds, images, and ideas that sometimes might be too complex or abstract for us to describe directly. According to Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. As educators, one of our responsibilities is to teach our students to love poetry or at least appreciate it. So it does not only contribute in their intellectual development but also in their emotional development. So today, I am tasked to present to you the subject-centered methods in teaching poetry to our students. Now, this includes poetics, metaphors, and genres. When we say poetics, it refers to the theory of literary techniques involved in composing verse or prose. It is concerned with the distinctive features of poetry with its language, forms, genres, and word modes of composition. With the use of poetics in teaching poetry, students will be able to analyze the poem they are reading. So in a resource material created by the Education Bureau of Hong Kong, they have identified 10 steps for us teachers to that we can share to students in order to let them analyze the poems. So the first step will be to look at the title, form, and shape of the poem. The next is to read the poem aloud to feel the mood, the tone, and the pace and the rhythm. Next is to identify the speaker and think about the voice and tone. The fourth step is to think about the setting of the poem. Where does the story happens, or where does the poem, or what places are mentioned in the poem itself. Okay, so the next step is to work out the subject and theme of the poem from diction and repetition used. The sixth step is to identify the sound effects such as rhymes, assonance, and alliterations in the poem. The next step is to identify the poetic devices such as similes, metaphors, and imagery, and think about how these add to the themes. The next step is to think again about the feelings, message, and ideas presented in the poem. And the next step is to think about how the poet communicates these ideas. And the last step now is to develop your personal response to the poem. Now, as students formed a general impression of the poem by doing the steps like reading the title, identifying the theme or the mood or the tone of the poem, it is necessary for students to progress from comprehension level to the application level, in which they will be able to appreciate the poems deeply and personally. So for a more in-depth level, the following aspects should be examined by the students. So the first one is the content or the subject and themes of the poem. What are the universal truths or the messages that they can get from that piece of poetry? The next is identifying the speaker, the tone, and the voice in which the poem is being told. Okay. The next is they have to examine the setting and the atmosphere of the poem. Is it a happy poem, or does it reflect a light atmosphere, or is it a dark or gothic type of poem? The next is to examine its form and structure, then the sound effects, the poetic devices, and the word choice in which the poem is the words that are used in the poem rather. So upon identifying the themes and stylistic features through underlining certain parts or scribbling some notes in the poem, the students will then write a critical analysis in the form of an essay. So this is the part where they will be able to analyze the poems based on the following aspects that are mentioned earlier. Like for example, in the content, what can they analyze from, or what can they say about the content or the subject or the theme of that piece of poetry? So the teacher should first show the students how it is done by providing examples for the analysis of each aspect. So a sample poem should be used here to teach how it's done, and after that, the students will be let to do some metaphor in teaching poetry. So the the resource that I have, or the reference that I have used here, is by Phyllis Witten in his in her paper, which is Inventing Metaphors to Understand the Genre of Poetry. So in this journal by Phyllis Witten that was published in the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, she created a strategy on understanding the genre of poetry by inventing metaphors. These are some of the quotes that are taken from the journal, which can really show how important it is to use metaphor, or how effective it is to use metaphor in teaching the genre of poetry. So, according to Phyllis Witten, analyzing the metaphors would enable the students to examine the nature of poetry without destroying the wholeness of the poetic experience. And another one is that metaphor then could be a useful vehicle for the students to use to express their thinking. Okay, so according to Within, analyzing the metaphors would enable the students to examine the nature of poetry without destroying the wholeness of the poetic experience, as it is stated here earlier. Okay, so the way the author did this is by introducing the idea of sketch to stretch. So in her journal rather, so in her journal, she was able to create a guideline for teachers to follow upon employing this strategy of inventing metaphors in order for the students to understand the genre of poetry. So first one is she used the strategy of sketch to stretch, in which the children or the students will be making symbolic sketches for their ideas, themes, and characters rather than summarizing or paraphrasing the text. So next one is before discussing, or before forming a circle on discussing the poem, she postponed the formal poetry analysis until after a lengthy immersion period, in which so that the students will be able to be familiarized with the text for a long period of time. So after that, she provided opportunities for students to create collaborative poems about what poetry means, because that is her topic. Or at the end of that class, they will be able to create a poetry or a poem using metaphors on what is poetry for them. So after that, they will be engaging in small group readings of similar poems by published authors. So next one is they will be extending the metaphors through small and large group brainstorming. So in this part, students will have should have been able to create their own or invent their own metaphors, and then it will be shared to the class. Using small and large group brainstorming. So when they are sharing their rough draft metaphors in the other circle, the teachers should encourage the students to look for patterns and connections among the metaphors, so that they can consolidate the themes of these metaphors that they have written. So when sharing, so after this, they will be, this is called a rough draft metaphor, because this is not the final metaphor that they will be using. So it will be refined and polished until like for example, it will be revised by their peers and so on. So when sharing refined metaphors in a large group, take an active role in asking students to relate their metaphors to each other and to further extend the metaphors rather than regard them as finished products. So it will be a work on process type of activity, where they will not treat it as something that is a finished product. So as the time goes by, or as days goes by, they will be able to refine their metaphors. So after developing metaphors, use them as a frame of reference while reading and writing additional poems, and test out and refine the ideas in the metaphors over time. Okay, so this is according to Phyllis Witten, this strategy really helped her in making the students understand the idea of a poem, because by doing something like inventing their own metaphor, and after that is creating a poem based on those metaphors that they have written. So in this strategy or method in teaching poetry, I use the reference from Kathy Bush, which is using a genre-based approach to teaching narrative poetry. Okay. So the next method here is genre, in which when we say genre, it is the classifications of the type of work or poetry that are used in the class. So in doing what Kathy Bush has done in her journal or in her study is used a genre study in teaching the narrative poetry to her students. So in doing a genre study, Bush emphasized that the teacher should give many examples of narrative poetries in order for the students to become familiar with the genre. According to Charles Cooper, one of the influential figures in genre study, he pointed out that students can learn about a written genre only if they read it. So it is important that students should read a lot of poems that are on the same genre that you are using as a teacher. So it is also important that these reading models should vary in length and topic to expose them to a wide range of possibilities a narrative poetry can have. So it should have, it's not only just short pieces of narrative poetries, but also it can vary in length and also in topics. So once students had a chance to respond to the text provided, so they will be able to list the basic features of narrative poetry. So the teachers will introduce them to some of the touchstone texts, where these touchstone texts will serve as model for students upon writing, and it will be the basis for their definition of what a narrative poetry is. So after that they have listed the basic features of a narrative poetry, students will then share the examples of narrative poetry they find. It is important in this process that the students will will find some example of the of narrative poetries from authors that are still alive, so that they will be able to relate it to their life, and it can lead them to think that poetry is not dead, and it is relevant in their lives as students. So after that, students will share some of the examples of the narrative poetry they find. So they should also, an important part of any genre study is exploring the relevance of the genre to the students' lives, in order for them to realize that literature is not just something that they have to learn in English lesson, but it is also present in their own world. So after that, they have to develop the topics for their narrative poems. After sharing their examples of narrative poetry, students will start to develop topics for their own narrative poems. Since students are limited to what genre they will write in, it is important that they will be the ones to choose their own topic, so that they will know that the material does not control them, but they will control the material. Okay, so the next one is to have the narrative poetry assignment. So students will write their narrative poems. So after brainstorming topics, they shall begin writing their own narrative poems. A rubric should be employed by the teachers, so that students will know what is expected of them upon writing these narrative poetry or poems. And also it will serve as a guide for them, so that they will not be lost on writing. Okay. So the next one is to examine the writer's craft. So there are mini lessons that teachers should provide mini lessons on skills and techniques in writing genre, okay, or the genre on narrative poetry. So before they will be able to write their narrative poems, mini lessons should be given by the teacher, so that they will know what concepts are included in narrative poetry. Next one is that the peers or their classmates will review their works, and after that, the works will be revised. So peer reviewing and revising must come after writing, and so that they will be able to know some errors committed while writing. It is important to find ways for students to understand that revision is an integral part of writing, and not just finding faults about their works, but also it is to give them the necessary criticisms to improve their writing. So after that, the teachers should provide publishing opportunities for the students' narrative poems. Publishing it will make it clear for students that literature is written for an audience, and gives them a chance to share their writings to other people. So an easy way to publish the work of the students is by creating an anthology for the poems or the narrative poems that they have written. So it can be in a form of a booklet, or it can also be a fun way. It can be done in a fun way, like for example, by creating a website that is dedicated for the narrative poems of the students. So in this website, they will be able to upload the poems that they have written, and so that they can share it also to other people. Okay, so another publishing possibility for this activity, or for the genre study, is by entering the students' work in a poetry contest. So sometimes magazines and newspapers have poetry contests, or some companies are having poetry contests, and by submitting these poetries that are written by students, they will be able to be recognized, and sometimes they are given like prizes and scholarships, so that it can help them also. Okay. And some incentives also can be given to them. Okay, so another important aspect of genre study, so the last one is the reflection. So this is one of the another important aspect of genre study, which comes after, like it is a reflection of what the activity has done for them as a person or as a student. So it gives the students a chance to look back on what they have learned and apply it to other contexts. We can begin this by briefly reviewing the features of narrative poetry and then allow students to consider how this genre has affected them as writers. So these are some of the subject-centered methods that are under the teaching of poetry. So Ma'am Karen, the next reporter, will be teaching us or will be presenting us the teacher-centered methods in teaching poetry.
Hello everyone! Today we're going to discuss about the teacher-centered methods in the methods and techniques of teaching poetry. I am Karanjit Sunga, your discussant for today. So let's start! I guess everyone's ready? Teacher-centered methods. These are the techniques requires the teachers to adapt the pedagogical strategies that are used for clarifying the matters, expanding the contents, motivating the learners, and consciousness raising. The teachers are remarkably active to deliver the contents through explanation and illustration. According to Frisch 1923, teacher-centered techniques have both strength and weakness. A few challenges in teaching poetry include not having a clear understanding of the genre's philosophical and scientific underpinnings, as well as its historical and scientific foundation. It is on the basis that students' performance in poetry or any other subject may depend on the ability of the teacher to master and present the subject matter in such a way that effective understanding of the lesson may be achieved. In short, the teacher should use different types of methods or techniques in which help students to easily understand the lesson. There are two methods in teacher centered. First one, we have the allowed reading, and the other one is using lectures. Let me read to you what is allowed reading. Teachers have been reading aloud to kids for many years. According to research, it has shown that read aloud improves comprehension, vocabulary, and fluency. Also, read aloud allow the teacher to model expert fluent reading of the text. Aloud reading is very effective method of teaching poetry. Reading aloud makes the student active and teaches about utterances, stress, intonation, rhyme, and rhythmical qualities of the poem. Teacher would ask the students to read the poem before their actual reading. In aloud reading, teacher would ask two groups of students to read the poem as they generally read. Here, teacher also do activities such as first, read the poem with proper seriousness and provide a good example of reading, and later on, ask the students to read with the feelings and emotions. A good teacher always first makes aloud reading to start to teach. Next, let's proceed to lectures. According to Lee, lecture is a pedagogical method whereby the teacher formally delivers a carefully planned for expository address on some particular topic or problem. This method is very important to unfold technique, emotions, and truth as the figure of speech. Lectures can be used to clarify matters, to review magnificent details of the lesson, to extend contents, and motivate students. Also, lecture provides opportunity to give information of style, background, and dramatic techniques. Teachers can divide his poems teaching on various aspects of poems and could tell students through the series of 4 to 5 lectures. And also, teacher can even ask students to speak for 5 minutes on the background genre or any relevant aspect of the poem. Through lecturing, teacher could make comment on the beginning or ending of the poem. In addition, explanation or illustration of major ideas or themes of the poem are given through lecturing. To be truly powerful and magical, the practice of reading aloud is actually quite complex. So, in reading aloud, there are important to enacting a powerful classroom read aloud. So, there are six aloud reading. First, we have the set the stage. First, there is an artfulness to a good read aloud. So, setting the stage is important. First, we must consider where and how do you sit to make sure all the students can see the book. Next, think about how can you create a sense of comfort and community so that the students feel that read aloud time is sacred, ritual part of your classroom culture. Also, consider how you want students to see it in order to minimize distraction and maximize the focus on the book. Second one is plan to read aloud. The key to a successful read aloud is careful, deliberate planning. The first step is planning. In planning, the first step in planning is selecting what to read. So it's very important that you need to plan what to read. Number three, establish a clear purpose. Being clear about your purpose will help guide decisions such as which questions you will ask, what think aloud you will plan, and how often you will stop engaging students in the story. Next, number four, practice before class. Remember, one of the most important goals of a read aloud is to model a fluent reading. Yet, many teachers choose books to read aloud without practicing, and as a result, mispronounce names or words, stumble, make mistakes, and are caught off guard by unexpected events in the story. So, as a teacher, we must first practice what we're going to teach to the kids so that we can avoid making mistakes. You can also use post it notes to plan questions. Think aloud and identify key vocabulary you want to define as you read. Additional tips on planning: use a specific planning template related to your purpose. So, find a partner to read with and get the feedback before reading to your class. So, as a teacher, we must practice first before we proceed or before we teach to our kids. And we also be an open-minded teacher to accept the feedback of your partner. So by having a partner, this will help you ensure that you can read the book, not just with fluency, but also with animation and expression. So we need to practice before class. Next, number five, make it interactive. So a good read aloud is interactive. Involve students in the story by asking them the open-ended questions you prepared. So before you start telling a story, as a teacher, we must first interact with our student. We can ask different types of questions and open-ended questions like, have you been in this place? Or what are the things that you know about this story? Also, as a teacher, we must provide quick definitions of synonyms of unfamiliar words that might get in the way of students comprehending the story. And finally, extending the read aloud. So after read aloud, consider how you can build on this modeling as you release students to guided or independent practice. Example, if your focus was on vocabulary, reread the pages in the book that had your focus words. Have the students repeat the words and engage in examples and non examples of the word beyond the context of the story. Have the students try to use these new words in their own writing to respond to the text. So these are the 6 important to enacting a powerful classroom read aloud. Now let's proceed to the advantages and disadvantages of lectures. There are 10 advantages of using lectures. First, it is economical and a large number of students can be taught at a time. Next, it saves time and covers syllabus in limited time. Third, it is very effective in giving factual information and in relating some of the thrilling anecdotes. The life stories of the great adventurers, experimenters, investigators, thinkers, and so on can become very interesting and valuable talks by the teacher. Number 4, lecturing makes the work of the teacher very simple. A good lecture must not only stimulates the students but also lingers long in their imagination. Next, number 6, it provides better scope for clarification and for laying stress on significant ideas. Number 7, it begins a personal contact and touch to impress or influence the pupils. Next, advantages of lectures, it gives the students training in listening and taking notes rapidly. So during lectures, it is very visible for the kids that as a teacher, we can see them taking notes while we are having our lectures. Next, number 9, it develops good audience habit. And lastly, number 10, it provides opportunities of correlating events and subjects. So, these are the 10 advantages of lectures. So, when we have advantages, we also have disadvantages. So, I have here 7 disadvantages of lectures. First disadvantage, there is a very little shape for pupils' activity. Next, it does not take consideration to individual differences. Number 3, lecturing is against the principle of learning by doing. So, of course, because most of the knowledge is coming from the teacher itself. Next, number 4, speed of lecture may too fast for the learners to grasp the line of thought. But it depends on the teacher on how he or she delivers the lesson to the kids. If the teacher is very fast or very slow. Next, number 5, the lecture is likely to cover more content without realizing the title learning takes place. Next, number 6, the lecture may become monotonous to the student. And number 7, last, disadvantages of lectures is on average, the students may not be able to fix up their attention to a lecture is 40 to 45 minutes. Of course, some of the students are their attentions while they're listening to the lectures of the teacher is very short period of time. So it is very encouraged that a teacher should deliver her lesson short and briefly, not just too long but direct to the point. Okay, so those are the disadvantages of lectures. All right, so that's the end of my report about the teacher centered methods. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned today. So, thank you so much.
Hello everyone, I am Crystal Malayang and I am going to present the student-centered method in teaching poetry. So the student-centered method is well suited to an active classroom because it allows the students to participate in the given task. So the learners are encouraged to participate in a series of tasks and of course with the collaboration with the other students. And the potential power of teaching poetry will always depend on the active and lively participation of every student inside the classroom. So here are the following methods that I am going to discuss. First is memorizing. Second is recitation. Third is asking anthology. To keep anthology rather. Then the last one is the creation of the poems. Okay, so the first method is of course memorizing. And this is one of the oldest pedagogical method of teaching poetry. So this method is suitable for students to develop an attitude towards learning poems. So first, the teacher will allow their students to choose poems that resonates with them in the first place. So this is one of the key to help them recite more effectively because they can easily memorize the poems once the poem itself would speaks their own emotions or feelings. Next is the process of memorizing and performing will help students to internalize the author's message, and of course it helps them to explore complex language and ideas within the poem. So that means when you are memorizing a poem, you are in an intimate connection with the person who made them or to the poet. And then, of course, as a task, the teachers will ask their students to memorize a poem. And while memorizing them, it gives them a great sense of how the thing is made, the sounds, and how the words rhymes. And that's where they can also have or understand the central idea of the poem. So this serves as an effective tool for teachers teaching poetry. And the last one is an understanding the text is the most important preparation for reciting a poetry. Because if the student doesn't understand the text, neither will the audience. Okay, here are the following tips in memorizing poems. So first, rewrite your poem by hand several times. So each time, try to write more and more of it from your memory. Okay, second is read your poem before going to sleep at night and repeat it when you wake up. Third is always carry around a copy of your poem in your pocket or either in your bag or whether in your bag, and find several moments throughout the day to reread or recite your poem. Then, next is practice your poem by saying it to a family, to your friends, or to your closest friends. Or say the first line over and over again until you can see it without looking your copy. Next, reveal the next line of the poem and say both of those lines together until you can say those words without looking at the poem. Okay, next method is recitation. Recite poems yourself. Okay, so this is a powerful way to show students how it can be done. So in this part, it can be introduced by the teachers first. Now they have to read the poem first with proper stress, rhythm, projection, while reciting a poem. So they will serve as the model first towards their students so that the students should know how or what is the proper way on how to recite the poem. And a successful recitation has a good pacing with proper pauses, voice inflection, and evidence of understanding, um, correct pronunciation, or the composure. Then next is allow class time for students to practice their poems. And then ask students to read and recite poems on their own. Then next is recitation should be done for 3 to 4 weeks or 3 to 4 times to make it better. And this helps the students for a better dialogue than to see the students' lines of poetry. Here are some basic tips on reciting poem. First is present yourself well and be attentive. Okay, no, so of course you have to prepare mentally and physically when you are reciting a poem. Second is have a good posture, project to the audience, and of course, avoid doing some unnecessary movements. Okay, third is be confident. Speak at a natural pace, don't rush, but don't speak too slowly. Okay, and the last one is make a direct connection with the audience. So in a strong recitation, a student should comfort an engagement with the audience through physical presence, including appropriate body language and confidence, so that the student could easily conveys powerfully and clearly the meaning of the poem to the audience. Okay, next method is asking to keep anthology. So in this method, many teachers require the students to keep anthologies so that they can record their favorite lines with necessary explanation. So that if ever they wanted to review again the poem, it is easy for them to locate those poems. Okay. Next is, and this is also effective way to keep their handwritten and commonplace, in which they may include their meditations, verses, and illustrations, as well as passages they found memorable while they are reading poems. So next is, it poses them activities like arranging the anthologies, juxtaposi- juxtaposing it, retitling it, and writing some short commentaries on it. Okay. Next is, so the teachers will require each student to keep a poetry folder in the classroom in order for them to compile all of their poems. Okay, and the next is the creation of poems. Okay, so you have to include on creative writing exercises for students as their task, because writing a poetry is a creation, or writing poetry is a creative art, and writing poetry is all about expressing your feelings that you cannot otherwise express. So you are just opening your soul to the world and showing people how you feel and perhaps how to feel. So if you cannot feel, you probably can't write poetry. So students composed poems using only words, phrases, or quotations from a text that they find it meaningful. So poetry can be hard, but it can be easy and funny at the same time, and heartbreaking and joyful too. So poems are the extensions of one's emotions. And the art of composing poetry is very useful for students' active involvement and learning of poetry. So it is also believed that students who write poetry will have a better understanding towards literature than others. So teachers will always encourage students to write about various types of poems and read it in the class to encourage others also. So those are the first four methods in teaching poetry for student-centered. And Miss Carmely will discuss the continuation of the student-centered method in teaching poetry. Okay, so thank you.
Hello, I am Carmela Hirona, and I will be continuing the report about student-centered methods in teaching poetry. I will be discussing the making portfolio, comparative study, warm up, reading the poem, and follow up. So let's start first with making portfolio. So making portfolio is said to be one of the best methods in direct participation of students in classroom. So it is a student method because there is an active learning engagement within the students. So they can deeply be involved in the poems, poetic languages, or the other aspects of literature. So with that, they can have a lot active learning engagement. Next is making portfolio can also develop their skills, though they can notice and explore the poetic language, and also they can critique their the poems, and they can refine their understandings of the different genres or the different techniques in literature. And also, as you know, making portfolio is really a great help to to track your progress. So students can track their development and see tangible evidence of their improvement. With that, they can reflect on their own writings and they can have thoughts on how to gain deeper knowledge of the different poems. And they can improve with just by reflecting their portfolio. That's it for making portfolio. Let's also have the next one, which is the comparative study. Why is comparative study a student-centered method? Because you are going to contrast or analyze two kinds of poems, and you're going to see if what are their similarities and their differences. With that, comparison for understanding. So you're going to relate how similar they are, how different they are. And with that, you are going to appreciate that every literature has its own beauty. So you are going to, it is going to encourage critical thinking and discussion. Also, in comparative study, it can help analyze different versions of poems. So in here, the students can see the poet's uniqueness and how it challenges traditional expectations. So as you can see, as time goes by, poems are also evolving. With that, the students can analyze the poems um, language, the poem's uniqueness, just by looking at the imagery, the language, and the meaning of the poem. And also, with a comparative study, you are going to appreciate the lyrical and metaphoric richness. Yes, poems really has its own beauties because of its rhythm, and imagery. So in that, by comparing different poems, you're going to discuss and analyze the different beauty of the poems. So that's it for the comparative study. Let's continue with the warm up. So, warm up means it is an initial activity or exercise designed to prepare students mentally and physically for the lesson ahead. So it is a student method because there is an interactive engagement in warm up. So this initiates class participation by prompting students to recall and share their favorite songs. When they share their favorite songs, it starts with that, and with that, they it is going to help them to encourage to participate in the recitation and build their understanding towards the poem. Next is comparative analysis. So with that, they are going to there's a discussion of similarities and differences of the text. They're going to see the elements of the poem before the start of the lesson. And lastly, there is a creative exploration in warm up. So warm up encourages students to offer unique and imaginative interpretations of the poem. So this one, they can brainstorm, they can recite pieces of other literatures that they can connect the poem that you're going to teach them, and also it fosters a deeper understanding of the material before the start of the actual lessons. So the next one, in reading the poem, is also one of the method that is student centered. It is because through reading, they can engage with the text. It could be individual or in a collective manner. It means by group. So, With that, they are going to comprehend the content, the style, and the nuances of the text. So, in reading the poem, there's also engagement through guided reading. So, the students actively engage with the poem as the teacher reads it. So, while the teacher is reading it, the student can start to analyze what is the poem wants to say, and also you can grasp the meaning, or you can start comparing what you have learned, and that's it. Next is there's also a collaborative interpretations in group. So reading the poem is not just only means an individual activity. You can also read it by group. So they can work together, they can collaborate and share their diverse experiences and ideas with the poems. And also there's independent exploration with visual support. So with reading, they can also see the visual. They can comprehend on their own, and the teacher can also guide the students on how to understand the poems. That's it for the reading the poem. So let's now have the last student-centered method in teaching poetry, which is follow up. So, for a quick meaning, follow up means involve checking comprehension and reinforcing learning through activities. So, follow up, one of the famous follow up activities is the question and answer. So, this helps to check the understanding if the students have really understood or how well they have understand the poem. And next is written response. It is a student-centered approach because in through follow-up, the students can write down what have they learned, or they can annotate what have they understood, their own interpretations and understandings of the poem. And next one is active engagement. There's also active engagement and follow up as you encourage the students to participate in sharing their insights of the poem. So they are going to share to the class what they have learned, to the theme of the or the message of the poem. They can share, and with that, the students have can learn from their other classmates, and they can also enhance their understanding. And for the last one, follow up also gives teacher let follow up also, you can see how flexible the teachers are. It's because the teacher are going to provide guidance to the students. So the teacher are going to provide and ensure that the students that really have learned, or they really understood what does the poem means. Okay, so that's it for the follow up, and that concludes our report about teaching poetry. So in behalf of my members, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you have learned something in our lesson. Thank you so much. And if you want to dig deeper with our lesson or our discussion today, these are our references. You can look at here, and that's all. That's all. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you have learned something. Okay, so if you want to learn something more with our discussion, here are our references. You can look into this, and that would be all. Thank you so much, and I hope you have learned something. Thank you. Goodbye.